Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. This is a video in response to an individual, a Hanafi, Maturidi, Jahmi, who has slandered a great scholar of this era, the Salafi scholar Shaykh Muhammad bin Salih al-Uthaymeen rahimahullahu ta'ala. And as you can see in the title in the video, Salafi belief, Allah wears clothes. And this is an attack, a slander upon Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah. And we are going to, inshallah ta'ala, address this slander and this lie and expose the ignorance and the deception of this individual, whom we have described as a Hanafi Maturidi Jahmi. Now, when we use the word Jahmi, this is not to make any judgment in any sense. It's simply a descriptive word to show the origin of this man's creed about Allah, His names and His attributes. And to make this clear and to explain what we mean so as not to be misunderstood, let us go to this canvas here. We have various labels, and what we are going to do here is to show the origin of what is called al-Kalam, al-Kalam, which is the way that these groups here, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, the Kullabiyah, the Ashari, and the Maturidiyah, among whom is this man here. He is a Maturidi Hanafi, and his creed is on the basis of al-Kalam. Now, al-Kalam, which is speculative theology, it is using speculation, metaphysics, philosophy as a basis for establishing belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with attributes or the absence thereof, to negate from Allah His attributes. So we have Aristotle, Plato, these were present around the 3rd or 4th century, and they spoke of a prime mover or a first cause and what is similar. And they used a certain type of language in order to describe that prime mover or first cause, which is basically to say that he is not a body, not a jism, not a substance, a jawhar, not an arad, which is like an incidental attribute, a temporal attribute. And likewise Plotinus, who came after Isa alayhi salam, I think he was in the 3rd century after Isa alayhi salam, and all of these share in their language in describing who or what they claim to be behind the universe, that he's pretty much abstract and he is not a body, he is not mutable, he is not divisible, he has no parts, he has no passions. This type of language, philosophical type of language, is the general idea of the creator or the deity or the prime mover or the first cause, or whatever names or labels they use to identify whoever is behind the universe. This became known as classical theism or negative theology, because one of the main features of this is to speak in terms of negatives, to negate from Allah rather than to make positive affirmations of attributes for Allah. And the reason for avoiding that is to avoid making Allah to be like the created bodies, the ajsam. Let us bring a few citations from non-Muslim sources to establish what we've mentioned so far. So the first citation is from F.E. Peters, writing in his essay, The Origins of Islamic Platonism, the School Tradition, published in a book called Islamic Philosophical Theology. And he states in this essay, there were many varieties of Platonism in Islam. One of the earliest of the Muslim theologians, Jahm bin Safwan, was promulgating, spreading, promoting a view of God remarkably different from that of his contemporaries, and yet remarkably like the negative theology current in later Greek Neoplatonism. Now, what does this mean? This means the language, not a body, not mutable, not divisible, does not have parts, does not have passions, does not have place. This type of language is known as negative theology. And this is not found in the revealed books, nor on the tongue of any messengers. It is from the inventions and fabrications of the misguided people, the philosophers, who were far, far away from revelation and from the sciences of prophethood, the knowledge that relates to the Creator and his names and his attributes. This speech originated with those philosophers. Some more citations we can bring from another paper, and this is from Cambridge University Press, which is titled Monopolar Theism and the Ontological Argument. And in this paper we have the following. Central to the idea of classical theism is the conception of God as a necessary being, the first cause of all existences, himself a pure actuality, simple and impassible, without body, parts and passions. This without doubt was the understanding of God held alike by Plato and Aristotle. And then also the following paragraph, where we have the following. Classical theism, whether under the influence of Plato, as was that of the Church Fathers, or under that of Aristotle, as was that of the scholastics, presented God as actus purus. Of the latter, Aquinas became the chief spokesman. And it goes on, but we come to the relevant part at the end here. The whole section from Q3, Article 1 to Q11, Article 4, is designed to prove that as self-subsistent being, God is without body, without imperfection, without limit, without mutability, without temporality, without parts. So as you can see clearly, this language is the language of Aristotle and Plato. And these are misguided, star-worshipping polytheists, misguided away, far, far away from the light of revelation, and who relied upon their intellects to come up with these notions and with these ideas. And these are the ideas that entered into the Jews and the Christians and the Sabians and likewise the Muslims through people like Jahm bin Safwan. And from Jahm bin Safwan came all of the offshoots, including the Asharis and the Maturidis. And we can also bring one more citation from Plotinus, and he died in the 3rd century, and he has a statement, and his notion of divinity has been summarized by these two authors. Plotinus taught that there is a supreme, absolutely transcendent one, which is beyond all categories of being and non-being. The concept of being is derived by us from the objects of human experience, but the infinite transcendent one is beyond all such objects, and therefore is beyond the concepts derived from them. Being or existence is an attribute, and the one is beyond all attributes as their source. The one cannot be any existing thing, and cannot be merely the sum of all such things, but is prior to all existence. And then they continue with the following. The one contains no division, multiplicity, or distinction. Thus, no attributes can be assigned to the one. The one, beyond all attributes, including being and non-being, is the source of the world, not through any act of creation, willful or otherwise, since activity cannot be ascribed to the unchangeable, immutable one. Now, all of this speech that you've heard from Aristotle, Plato, Plotinus, by way of example, this is the central idea of Jahm bin Safwan, and on the basis of these ideas did he begin to deny that, for example, Allah is above the throne, and that Allah spoke the Quran, and that Allah will be seen in the hereafter. He denied that Allah will be seen in the hereafter. And all of it is on the basis of this philosophy, which is centered around the idea of not ascribing a body or a bodily form or any of the attributes, any types of attributes. Why? Because attributes from our experience, from what we see in the world, only exist in things which can be described as bodies. So this is the starting point of the tawheed of the Jahmiyyah. And this is not what the prophets and messengers came with. And of course, if you come from this starting point, then you are going to start looking at the texts of the attributes in a certain way. And you are going to operate upon the premise that these texts, they contain tajseem and tashbih, which have to be dealt with. And thus we find the idea of ta'wil, of metaphorically interpreting the texts and claiming that these are allegories. One of the effects of this philosophy is that the groups of Kalam, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, the Kullabiyya, the Ash'ariyya, the Maturidiyya, and others like the Karramiyya and the Salimiyya, all of them had differences amongst themselves. They differed with each other. And that's because this philosophy is from the intellects of men. That's why you see the Mu'tazila arguing and refuting the Asharis, and the Asharis refuting the Mu'tazila, and the Karramiyya refuting others from the people of Kalam, and then we have the Salimiyya, and then we have the Maturidiyya. We find incoherence, difference, contradiction, refutation between them all, despite the fact that the foundation of their speech about Allah, His names and attributes, all returns to the same al-Kalam. And this is a proof of its futility, because truth does not lead to splitting, separation, difference, contradiction, which is what we find amongst the groups of Kalam. So some of them deny everything, which are the Jahmiyyah, who are the closest to the Greek philosophers. They deny everything, names, attributes, actions. Others among them, like the Mu'tazila, they affirm the names, apparently and outwardly, yet they deny the attributes. Then we have those who try to take a middle yet contradictory path, such as the Kullabiyya and the Ash'ariyya and the Maturidiyya, affirming some attributes but negating others. And then basically they use language and tricks with language and bending over backwards to try to justify their contradiction and incoherence. And all of this is the clear sign and the clear evidence that this thing cannot be from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not from His revelation. In contrast, the people of the Sunnah, they have a single uniform principle, which is to affirm whatever Allah affirms for Himself, without tamthil, without takyif, without likening, and without specifying a how. And so anything that they find in the revealed texts in which Allah has clearly ascribed Himself an attribute, then they take it upon this principle, upon the firm belief that there is no likeness between the reality of Allah's attributes and the reality of the attributes of the creation. So there's no contradiction or incoherence. It is a single uniform principle. Now this philosophy, or this classical theism, or this negative theology, it is something that basically affected the Jews and the Christians and the Sabaeans. So the philosophy of these people had an effect upon the Jews and the Christians and the Sabaeans. And after Islam, this was also imported into Islam by way of certain characters such as Ja'ad bin Dirham and Jahm bin Safwan, and they appeared at the beginning of the 2nd century. And a group known as the Jahmiyyah arose, and the Salaf, they began to hear the statements of the Jahmiyyah, and they understood what they were trying to say. They were trying to say that Allah Azza wa Jal does not speak, Allah Azza wa Jal is not above His throne, Allah Azza wa Jal did not speak to Musa alayhi salam, Allah Azza wa Jal will not be seen, And so they heard this type of language, and this type of language is clearly based upon the philosophy, the rhetoric, and the speculation of these nations and these individuals. This is not found in the Quran or the Sunnah or upon the tongue of any of the Sahaba or any of the early Salaf, the Tabi'een, in this particular time period. And the Salaf were also wise, and they understood what the inevitable conclusion is from this type of philosophy. It actually necessitates atheism. It leads to the non-existence of a creator. If you take this philosophy to its logical, rational conclusion, then this is inevitably the outcome you are going to come to. And you will be left with a notion of a deity or a creator, which is simply a notion in the mind only. It's abstract and in the mind only, not having any real existence outside of the mind. So the Salaf, they understood and they were wise to what the Jahmiyyah was saying, and that's why there are many statements from the early Salaf making remarks such as that the Jahmiyyah are trying to say that there is nothing above the creation, or that there is nothing above the throne. To give you an example of one of their statements, this is the statement of Jarir bin Abdul Hamid, who said, "Kalam al-Jahmiyyah awwaluhu asal wa akhiruhu sam." The speech of the Jahmiyyah, the first part of it is honey, and the last part of it is poison. Indeed, they are trying to say, وَإِنَّمَا يُحَاوِلُونَ أَن يَقُولُوا لَيْسَ فِي السَّمَاءِ إِلَهٌ. They are trying to say that there is no deity above the heaven. There's also the statement of Asim bin Ali bin Asim al-Wasiti. He's the Shaykh of al-Bukhari, rahimahullah, and he said, نَاظَرْتُ جَحْمًا فَتَبَيَّنَ مِنْ كَلَامِهِ أَنَّهُ لَا يُؤْمِنُ أَنَّ فِي السَّمَاءِ رَبًّا. I debated with Jahm bin Safwan, and it became clear from his speech that he does not believe there is a Lord above the heaven. So these are only two statements. There are many other statements which are like this from the Salaf. So the point being that the Jahmiyyah innovated this new speech about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, having been influenced by the Jews, the Christians and Sabians in debates and discussions, and that itself has its origin in the philosophy of Aristotle, Plato, Plotinus. And they brought this into Islam, and this is speech about Allah, that He is not a body, He does not have a'rad, meaning He does not have attributes, and He is not divisible, He is not composed, He has no parts, He is not above the creation, He's not outside the creation, He's not inside the creation, He's not this, He's not that. All of this is innovated philosophical babble that has never been found on the tongue of any prophet, of any messenger, nor in any revealed book. Now the Jahmiyyah were few in number at the beginning, and they really had to hide and conceal themselves because the Salaf knew the outcome of this philosophy, and the Salaf were very, very stern and very severe against the Jahmiyyah. However, the Jahmiyyah passed on their creed to the Mu'tazila. So the Mu'tazila adopted this statement from the Jahmiyyah, and over the next century or so, in the second century, they gained prominence, and they also gained influence over many of the rulers. And so they adopted the statement of Jahm, they popularized it, and they also developed it further by the writing of books and expanding the philosophy. This was also taken by the Rafidah. The early Rafidah, they were Mujassima. They actually likened Allah to the creation. They were Mushabbiha. But that lasted for a period before they adopted the doctrine of the Mu'tazila. So then they became Mu'tazila, and part of that was the negation of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon the way of the Jahmiyyah. So here we are now at the end of the 2nd century and the early 3rd century, and this is when these people, the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila, they put many scholars such as Imam Ahmad and others to trial on the basis of this ilmul kalam. Now, when we say ilmul kalam, we mean something very specific. We do not mean debate and discussion and establishing the truth with sound evidences, whether from the Quran or whether sound rational evidences. We are not referring to that as kalam. By ilmul kalam, we mean something very specific. It is the specific kalam that these groups entered into, which is the kalam on the basis of Aristotelian metaphysics and philosophy, al-ajsam, wal-a'rad, wal-jawahir, bodies, substances, accidents, and using the categories of Aristotle, what he calls the 10 categories, using them as a foundation to prove that the universe has a beginning and therefore has a creator, and then you are bound by that same language, al-ajsam wal-a'rad, in order to affirm or negate for that creator that you claim to have established by way of this argument. And that's why the speech of all of these groups, when you think about it, it all revolves in its foundation. It revolves around the speech of Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus, which is negating Jismiyyah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this became the central concept behind Tawheed for them. And it led them to have an evil perception or evil outlook towards many of the texts of the attributes. So then we come into the 3rd century and we have Ibn Kullab and his likes. And Ibn Kullab was not really grounded in the Sunnah, and he began to debate with the Mu'tazila, and he basically took a middle position between the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila and what the Salaf were upon. And this was really after Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala had really dealt with the Jahmiyyah and Mu'tazila and had debated them and subdued them and exposed their reality to the Ummah. Ibn Kullab came along and he kind of rekindled this issue, and he came up with a hybrid or a kind of belief or doctrine which is in between. He affirmed many of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the 7 which are affirmed by the Asharis and Maturidis, such as life, knowledge, will, power, hearing, seeing, speech. And he also affirmed the sifat khabariya, meaning those attributes which we only know by way of khabar, by way of revelation. And from those attributes are the attributes of al-wajh, which is face, and al-yadan, which is hands. And likewise, he affirmed the ulu of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah is above His creation. And he had many refutations of the Mu'tazila and the Jahmiyyah in this regard. Now, al-Ashari, who came in the 4th century, he was originally a Mu'tazili. He was a Mu'tazili. And he was raised in a Mu'tazili household. And it is said that at the age of 40, he abandoned that doctrine when the Mu'tazila and the heads of the Mu'tazila were unable to answer certain questions that showed the flaw in their doctrine regarding al-Qadr. So he abandoned them, and he ended up in the circles of the Kullabiyah, and he took the doctrine of the Kullabiyah. And this then became the creed of the early Asharis. We have to distinguish between the early Asharis and the later Asharis, because there is a difference. So the early Asharis, such as al-Ashari himself and al-Baqilani and Ibn Mahdi al-Tabari and al-Qalanisi and others like them, they were upon the way of Ibn Kullab, which is to affirm the attributes and to affirm Allah's ulu that he is above the throne, above his creation, that he has attributes of face, hands, the sifat khabariyah. They affirmed all of this. It was only the later Asharis who came along, starting from the time of al-Juwayni in the 5th century. They are the ones who began to basically turn back towards the way of the Mu'tazila. They went back towards the way of the Mu'tazila. So they began to deny those attributes which Ibn Kullab and al-Ashari and al-Baqilani, which they actually affirmed. So al-Juwayni, al-Razi, al-Ghazali, and other than them, they took this path. So what do we have here? We have the Mu'tazila arguing with the Kullabiyah, and Ibn Kullab being unable to refute the Mu'tazila in the issue of Allah's speech. They adopted a hybrid creed, a creed which kind of really combines between what the Salaf were upon and what's in the Athar with al-Kalam. And they negated the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the chosen actions that Allah acts according to His will and Allah speaks according to His will. They were unable to refute the Mu'tazila on this issue, and that's why they came up with a hybrid creed. That creed then became the basis for the creed of the early Asharis, who affirmed more attributes than the later Asharis. The later Asharis, they kind of tended back towards the way of the Mu'tazila and the Jahmiyyah in negating the Sifat Khabariyah in particular. And as for the Maturidis, they came later. So we are really now speaking about the 6th and the 7th centuries, when their creed developed properly. At the beginning, there were few in number. It wasn't really till the 6th or 7th century when it became more prominent. And the Maturidiyah themselves, they were in direct contact with the Mu'tazila. So really the source of the creed of the Maturidis is more so from the Mu'tazila than it is from the Kullabiyah. And that's why from the outset, the Maturidiyah, they did not affirm some of those attributes that the early Ash'aris affirmed, having taken from Ibn Kullab, such as the ulu of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the sifat khabariyah, such as al-wajh wal-yadan, and so on and so forth. There is also another group which we refer to as the mutafalsifa, and these are the likes of Ibn Sina and people like him, and they were also upon the philosophy of Aristotle, Plato, and the Greek philosophers, and they have language which is identical to the people of Kalam. So all of these people here, the mutafalsifa, along with the Jahmiyyah and their offshoots, they are all united and agreed upon this language of al-ajsam wal-a'rad, and in describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with negations. Allah is not a jism, Allah is not a jawhar, Allah is not an arad, Allah is not mutable, Allah does not have parts, Allah does not have passions, and so on and so forth. All of this language is common between them all. And all of them recognize, all of them have statements. In fact, there are statements from Ibn Sina and al-Ghazali and al-Razi, all of them clearly admitting that if we were to go to the common people and describe the Creator, describe Allah by way of this language, then most of them would become atheists. Most of them would not accept this type of deity. This has actually been said by the likes of al-Ghazali. And that's because this type of speech, this type of philosophy, it does not really provide any true and real knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you speak, with these negations, and you make tawheed to be centered around these types of negations. But this is what the creed of all of these people is actually centered around. Its origin is from the speech of Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus. And this is what eventually appeared upon the tongues of the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, the Kullabiyah, the Asha'ira, and the Maturidiyah. Another important point to note is that many of those people of Kalam who ascribed to the four Imams, the ones that came later, they tried to impute the four Imams, Abu Hanifa, Imam al-Shafi'i, Imam Malik and Imam Ahmed, with this particular kalam, with this particular speech. We find that with the Hanafis, and we also find that with some of the Hanbalis who came centuries after Imam Ahmed. They authored books which they tried to ascribe to Imam Ahmed, and within these books, and likewise Abu Hanifa, and within these books can be found this philosophical rhetoric and philosophical speech about bodies, ajsam and accidents, a'rad, and building a creed or speech about Allah, His essence, His names and attributes on the basis of this language. Now this is unknown from these Imams. They never spoke with the likes of this language. In fact, there are narrations from the likes of Abu Hanifa where this type of speech is negated. An example of that is what has been related by al-Harawi in his book Dhamm al-Kalam, and likewise as-Suyuti in Sawn al-Mantiq. And within there is a narration from Nuh al-Jami'. He's one of the students of Abu Hanifa, and he said, قلت لأبي حنيفة, I said to Abu Hanifa, ما تقول فيما أحدث الناس من الكلام في الأعراض والأجسام. What do you say about what the people have innovated about this speech to do with accidents and bodies? So he said, فقال مقالات الفلاسفة. It is the statements, the speech of the philosophers. عليك بالأثر وطريقة السلف وإياك وكل محدثة فإنها بدعة. So he said, upon you is the narration and the way of the Salaf, and beware of every novelty, every new thing, because it is an innovation. So when you see the Maturidis, the Hanafi Maturidis, bringing books which they ascribe to Abu Hanifa, and within these books there are statements that are correctly ascribed to Abu Hanifa. However, any speech about, for example, Allah is not a body, Allah does not have parts, Allah is not in a place, Allah is not divisible, all of this type of philosophical speech which is built around al-a'rad wal-ajsam, then all of this is falsely attributed to Abu Hanifa. And likewise, Imam Ahmed, some of the later Hanbalis also tried to ascribe that speech to Imam Ahmed. Now, on account of this ilm al-Kalam, which is an innovation in Islam, then innovation has an effect upon its people. Innovation has an effect upon its people, and it made them to inherit enmity and dislike towards the people of the athar, the people of the narrations, the Salaf, and the people who are upon the way of the Salaf. And that's why you will find all of these groups sharing in their enmity and their dislike against the people of the Sunnah, the people who follow the way of the Quran and the Sunnah and the Sahaba and the Salaf in speaking about Allah, which is ithbat bila tamthil, which is to affirm for Allah whatever He affirmed for Himself without likening with the creation nor specifying the how. And so what they do is, found among them are those people who lie and deceive in misrepresenting the way of the Salaf, and the scholars who are upon the way of the Salaf, they misrepresent that and they twist the words and they deceive and they lie. And because of the complexity of the topic, it is very easy to mislead people about the reality of a person's creed or a person's statement in creed. And that's why they make the accusations against the people upon the way of the Salaf that they are mushabbiha, they are mujassima, that they are anthropomorphists, they liken Allah to His creatures, they resemble Allah to His creatures, and they say words such as they turn Allah into a body, They say Allah has parts. They say Allah is this. All of this type of speech has its origin and roots in the philosophy of Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus and the Greek philosophers, in general of that era. Now, coming back to this man here, this man is a Hanafi Maturidi Jahmi. Now you should clearly understand why we have used the word Jahmi, because it is descriptive of the belief or the source of his belief, where his speech about Allah, His names, His attributes, what the true source of that is. It is from Jahm bin Safwan, who imported this philosophy into Islam. And what we are going to explore is the effect of this innovation upon the people who hold on to it, which is the likes of this individual here, and the way they speak about the people of the Sunnah, the way they slander them, the way they misconstrue what they are really saying. And that itself, when they make these claims, that itself is built upon many layers of ignorance. And so that is what we are going to explore when we answer the allegation of this particular individual against a great scholar such as Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullahu ta'ala. Now, if you want more information, more background information to read and to learn more about this history, then you can go to asharis.com. There are many extensive articles on this subject and on this particular history. So I direct you to this website for background reading and to fill any gaps that you may have in this particular subject area. So coming back, this is really an introduction. This is part 1 of this series. And in the next part, we are going to introduce the actual topic, this claim, this allegation, his claim of this alleged Salafi belief that Allah somehow wears clothes. This is a gross slander, a gross misrepresentation, which itself is built upon layers of ignorance. So we are going to analyze these claims and clarify the doubt or the misconception that this individual is using to slander the Salafi scholar Shaykh Muhammad bin Salih al-Uthaymeen rahimahullahu ta'ala.